Hey everybody, today is Monday, January 8th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Maestro, editor Michelle Tesoro.
That is an idea that had been living in Bradley's mind for years. So I think it's an example of a director really having a very specific vision and being able to tell all of the department heads involved what it is and everyone executing exactly as he had imagined it. I really like the idea of every edit being invisible. I don't want you to be thinking about how we're editing it. But I suppose by not editing, you are also making a dramatic point about the editing. The idea of the editing that we did in this film was more about how are we telling the whole story of the film and what is the rhythm of the entire film, not just the rhythm that you create within a scene.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, here we go. Podcast time, hot editing talk time, rough cut time. Time for me to get going on with the show. Time for me to get rid of this cold. Ugh. Hopefully it's gone before 2025. Anyway, we get another great episode on tap for you, as today we are meeting with editor Michelle Tesoro to talk about her new film with actor-director Bradley Cooper. And that film, of course, is Maestro. You may recall that Michelle was on in 2020 to talk about her work on The Queen's Gambit. If you have not seen that series, what am I saying? You had to have seen that series. Anyone that loves editing enough to listen to me host a podcast about it has seen The Queen's Gambit already. Suffice to say, it's an amazing series and tremendous work by Michelle. And who would not want the editor of The Queen's Gambit to edit their movie? I do not know. Certainly not Bradley Cooper, who trusted Michelle with the editorial duties of this very big movie. Maestro is ostensibly about legendary composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, but really it's about the life and complicated love story he shared with his wife Felicia. How well Michelle and Bradley Cooper captured and encapsulated that story in a little over 2 hours, well, that is both a testament to them as storytellers and also collaborators. And Michelle will give us her testimony in a few moments. But before that, let me give you some important info I think you need to know. First, of course, is the 411 on our friends and sponsor Extreme Music. Now, when you're doing a biopic about Leonard Bernstein, let's be honest, you're probably not going to have any trouble coming up with a score for your film. But since Michelle and Bradley Cooper already did that movie, you're just going to have to come up with another story to tell. And that story is going to need great music, what the kids call production audio. And Extreme Music has been the preeminent name in production audio since 1997. Why them? Why are they the best? Well, it all starts with the talent, of course. Musical giants like Quincy Jones, Trent Reznor, Michael Giacchino, Hans Zimmer, and many, many more. And you can easily find their incredible tracks by searching on all the keywords one would associate with music. Tempo, lyrics, composer, genre, all that stuff. You can even upload a reference track to them, as in one for them to refer to. One that you really like but maybe you can't get for your movie. And then Extreme Music will find you an affordable one that's as good, if not better. They make all the licensing stuff really easy. You can do it right there on their website, or talk to a real nice person located in an office near you. So the next time you have a story to tell, make it sound great with production audio from Extreme Music. Okay, something else you absolutely have to know if you want to learn all that you can about the incredible editors and filmmakers here on The Rough Cut is that over on the Frame.io blog, you can avail yourself of a transcription of these interviews. Think of that. You don't even have to listen to me talk to get this great info. On top of that, the beauty of the blog format is that the topics we discuss and the references we make here in the podcast can be fleshed out with beautiful images, videos, and even fun things like Spotify playlists. You know how I love to talk about those needle drops. And if you do think you can still stomach listening to me talk, well, you can even listen to the podcast through the embedded player on the blog while you follow along with all those great supporting assets I mentioned. It's like film school on a page. So visit blog.frame.io/theroughcut to see what I mean. And if you don't have a pen handy, well, you can just check out the link in the episode show notes and it'll do the work for you. And isn't that what we all want? Something to do the work for us? And with that, we are on our way to talk to editor Michelle Tesoro about how she made beautiful music in the cutting room for Maestro. Probably have every answer perfectly ironed out.
Yeah, right. I want to be fresh. Have a new take.
Well, prior to Maestro, your last two projects were The Queen's Gambit, which, if people didn't know it before, really showed the world what a fantastic editor you are. And then you followed that up with Flag Day, directed by Sean Penn, which showed the world you can work really well with actors who become directors. So knowing both of those things, how did that all parlay into you getting the job cutting Maestro for Bradley Cooper?
Well, Bradley and Sean are friends. So I believe they worked together on Licorice Pizza, but I feel like they've known each other longer than that. Although I don't know that for a fact. But I was working with Sean on Flag Day and actually finishing the film. I remember being on the mix stage with him. Well, actually, it wasn't on the mix stage. We were cutting on a mix stage. I was cutting at Wiley Stateman's place at 24/7 Sound in Topanga, and we were using their main mix stage as a cutting room. I had plugged in my computer and my Avid into their thing so we could cut with this huge screen and everyone, because, you know, it was still 2021 and we're trying to keep a lot of social distance. And so Sean was like a good 20 feet away from me. And yeah, I just remember we were cutting and Sean was texting and he turned to me and said, well, I just texted Bradley Cooper that Michelle Tesoro is a goddess or something, or a god or editing god. So I don't remember what the wording was. And I was like, okay, that's weird, but all right. But anyway, what it translated to is when he was screening the final cut of the film for some friends, Bradley saw it and had asked about me. And, you know, Bradley was familiar with the different stages that Sean had gone through on that film. So he had a little bit more of an inside knowledge of where he had come, you know. And then we met and we worked on what we now call the proof of concept for Maestro, which was a series of camera tests that we fashioned into like a proof of concept for the film.
Well, the movie is called Maestro, so presumably it's about conductor and composer Leonard Bernstein. Mm-hmm. But it is definitely more than that, as Bernstein's wife Felicia factors into the story every bit as much as he does. What did Bradley say to you about what he wanted to focus on in this film and what he wanted audiences to know and to feel about these two people?
I mean, I think he wanted to show, he wanted to tell a story about marriage, and he wanted to show just their particular kind of love.
Well, knowing where to start films in general is tough. I mean, especially biopics where you have to encapsulate someone's life, it can be really difficult to sort that out. Mm-hmm. Now, you start out simply with a quote from Bernstein, followed with the scene of him as an older man. He's playing the piano at home in front of a camera crew, and he's moved to tears by this piece that he's playing, and follows it up by telling the crew about how much he misses Felicia and that he sometimes sees visions of her around the house. That all feels like a pretty well thought out way to start things, but were there other things that you tried and that's where you ended up, or was it basically shot and edited as scripted?
So that particular scene was not in the original opening of the script. He originally wanted to open it on what is the next scene, which is the phone call ringing in the dark and overhearing a young Lenny Bernstein get the call about needing to be the replacement, and an opening of the curtain and what follows with him running out into Carnegie Hall, right? But where we ended up was that scene in color, and it actually was a scene that we shot towards the end of shooting, where it was the entire interview, which, if you've seen the film, we also close with that interview with him in the red sweater and older in 1985. And I think initially we were thinking that was going to be the end, that we were going to basically tell the story chronologically. And what we found was we really needed to ground the film in the idea of being about Lenny and Felicia. And we felt like this scene really did that, and that it was important to do that in the beginning and to wrap it up at the end that way as well.
So that quote from Bernstein that I mentioned, the one that opens the film, mm-hmm. It was, "A work of art does not answer questions, it provokes them. And its essential meaning is in the tension between the contradictory answers." When you read the script, the work of art in this case, what questions did it provoke in you that you either asked Bradley or just tried to solve on your own?
I mean, I don't think I really had a lot of questions. I think what the quote represents really is how Bernstein lived a life of contradictory things. And it was really like a work of art. You know, he loved everyone and everything and wanted to do everything. And as you could see in the film, we traverse a lot of periods of time in their life. And I think when you're thinking about the contradictory actions and contradictory feelings, the quote is meant for you to kind of to think about what does that mean, and how that gave his life meaning, and how maybe we all sometimes do things that are contradictory, but it really represents living like a dynamic life.
The last interview I did was with editor John Paul about The Color Purple, and I told him I don't usually ask questions about the producers on a film, but with, in his case, Steven Spielberg and Quincy Jones and Oprah Winfrey, kind of had to make an exception. With Maestro, not only do you have Bradley as a producer, but you have, again, Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, among others. Tell me about the influence they had on the film and any interaction you may have had with them, either through notes or directly in the cutting room.
Stephen had a lot of interaction with us during that phase of the film where Bradley had finished. Actually, Bradley was very open about where we were in the process of editorial with everybody, including Stephen. We didn't really wait for, a full director's cut to be done before we showed all the producers the cut. We would show bits, sequences here and there to Stephen, and they had a very close rapport, text messages back and forth. I think there's a lot of interviews about where they talk about all the many text messages. I think iMessage and WhatsApp is Bradley's communication of choice. But yeah, they had a very lively interaction, and Stephen gave us a lot of really good ideas about what he found that was strong in the film, what needed help. And Bradley and I would take those ideas and really think about how we could address them individually and how we wanted to address them in Bradley's specific style of storytelling. So that it wasn't like we're trying to make a Steven Spielberg movie or anything like that. We're trying to make a Bradley Cooper movie. We're trying to make a movie that would represent Lenny and Felicia. Because as we know, sometimes a film tells you what it needs and you can't really enforce a lot to it. So having said that, Stephen is a very active producer. Marty, we showed the film a little bit late in the process. He did have, a few notes, but of course the film was in a different stage at that point. We had worked out a lot of things and obviously it had a lot of music and sound work and all this stuff that kind of makes it, a different playing experience than one would if you're just looking at a rough cut that doesn't have, sound work and stuff. So he did have feedback, and we did the same thing. And as we did with every other producer, Fred Berner and Amy Durning and even Scott Stuber and Netflix is, we really like to listen to what everyone has to say and really apply our own methods and ways to address their thoughts.
Well, immediately following that opening scene, which is shot in color and with a 16:9 aspect ratio, as you said, you jump back in time to a younger Bernstein prior to meeting Felicia, and it's in black and white with a 4:3 ratio. And then it does go back to color, but still 4:3. And then after Felicia passes, it returns to color and 16:9. So I am sure this is one aspect of the film that's been talked about extensively by this point. But since I'm not above beating a dead horse, please tell me about those decisions and the reason Bradley wanted to go that route, and if it was something that was ever debated during post.
No, I think Bradley had really thought about this in the pre-production phase of it. I mean, as I said to you, when I first started working with Bradley, we worked on a proof of concept, and which was made up of camera tests. And with all those camera tests, we were experimenting with the different aspect ratios. The 133, which is a 4:3. We're not in a 16:9, but we are in a 185, which is slightly, the height is different. I believe 16:9 is 178. So we experimented with all different kinds. I mean, we experimented with 240, with 178, with 133, black and white film and video. And I think he really felt that the story lent itself to foreground and background. He also liked the shape of using the entire height of a container, and not necessarily needing the entire width all the time. And I think he also wanted to tell the story in terms of, their well-documented life. If you look up their life, it's so well documented, and you would see them in black and white photos. You would see them in video that's in 1:3:3. And he thought perhaps if we stayed within the ratio and the medium in which we would have seen them at that time period, it would just give you more of a sense of being with them.
So the first scene of young Lenny Bernstein, as you mentioned, is him getting a call to fill in for another conductor who's sick to conduct the New York Philharmonic at Carnegie Hall for a live broadcast. He jumps out of bed, and then what follows is a oneer of sorts that transitions to an overhead shot following him through the apartment, into the hall of his apartment, and then directly into the balcony of Carnegie Hall. And the camera flies around the concert hall and then back to Bernstein and follows him into the backstage area of the hall. And while he's waiting backstage, you hear the radio announcer of the broadcast explaining about Bernstein filling in for the other conductor. And then the camera follows him out onto the stage where he begins conducting the orchestra. Throughout all that, the first visible edit you see is a dissolve from him conducting to on stage after the concert, where it's explained to the audience that he was only notified that morning that he would be conducting. That is a lot to cover in a 2-minute sequence. The nature of it is fantastical and dreamlike, a style that does get revisited in another specific scene later on. But for this one in particular, please give me a rundown of how all that came together and the techniques you employed to pull it off so well.
So there are actually a couple of very invisible edits when he gets out of bed and runs to the balcony of Carnegie Hall, and then again backstage when he's coming out, the camera flying around and then flying backstage. That is an idea, the way that all plays out, that had been living in Bradley's mind for years. So I think it's an example of a director really having a very specific vision and being able to tell all of the department heads involved what it is, and everyone executing exactly as he had imagined it. You mentioned the cut, which is basically a dissolve, right? From what we call the downbeat rest, which is what he was worried about, like, that there's a downbeat rest and I haven't practiced with the orchestra. That once he goes into conducting the orchestra and we're dissolving into this other moment, when Bradley was at Carnegie Hall, he wanted to capture this moment of the aftermath of having succeeded. And, he wasn't sure at the time where this piece was going to go, but he felt like it was really important to capture. There was some times where that moment, we had it at the end of the film. We were never sure, but we included it because we wanted to make sure that the audience knew that there wasn't any question of how successful that evening was. And it's really like our first little time cut in there.
Well, in the description of that scene that I just gave, I mentioned that before he walked out on stage, you heard a radio announcer explaining what was happening, who Bernstein is, who he was filling in for.
Right, the CBS announcer.
Yes, exactly. So the sound is treated as if it's diegetic. The voice sounds like it's coming out of a radio, but there's no radio visible there backstage.
Right.
Was that something you added in later to help provide context for what was happening?
So Bradley had written this in, because that is the actual live broadcast. If you go to YouTube, and you can YouTube this of the 1940, I think it was 1943, you can hear the audience in the background actually clapping, half-heartedly, and Bernstein conducting. It's like, because it was a live radio show that they were doing. So he had written this in the script, and so it was always a part of it. And I think we played with the idea of it being in the room, and it kind of went in and out, but I think it sort of now works more as a voiceover and just as a reminder of, hey, this thing happened live, and you can be, through the magic of editing, you can be in two places at once, at home listening to this and seeing what it was like, experiencing it from his point of view.
Well, on a similar note, again, with the challenge of encapsulating someone's life or a large portion of it, there is a lot of exposition that needs to get worked in there as gracefully as possible. In the process of shaping the story, was that an element you had to pay close attention to, that the audience knew enough about Bernstein and about Felicia, but not to the point that it had a negative effect on the pace or the real focus on the love story between the two of them?
I think we always struggle with that, don't we, in any version? I think, luckily we did have devices such as the CBS announcer to give you that backstory in a creative, exciting way. and I think within the dialogue as well, especially when we meet Felicia, we get to know a little bit of who they are with that window. They're standing at the window at the party, getting to know each other. But you're also, at the same time, you're getting information, but you're also not just expositional information, but emotional information. As, in that one scene at the window, you're seeing that they're connecting, yet you're also understanding who they are at that moment. But yeah, I think you struggle with that throughout because obviously, we cover many decades and you have to keep kind of replanting, this is who they are now. This is where they are now.
Well, that opening sequence of him conducting at Carnegie Hall, if you stopped watching right after that, you might be led to believe that the whole movie was going to be frenetic with a lot of fanciful editing. But with a few exceptions, it's actually quite the opposite. I mentioned I did that podcast about The Color Purple. At the risk of making this interview seem like it's about other editors, Maestro reminded me of a discussion I had with Kevin Tent and Alexander Payne about The Holdovers.
Yes.
And I asked Payne how Kevin came to be his go-to editor, and Payne said Kevin was recommended to him by a friend, and Kevin sent over a reel, which is an outdated concept. And the first clip on the reel was this long master shot. And Payne asked Kevin, what's the deal with sending me a clip with basically no editing? And Kevin responded, well, that shows you I know when not to cut. So I bore you with that.
I love that. You're not boring me.
Well, I say that because Maestro has a lot of scenes with little visible editing, and it's often between Leonard and Felicia. I think you just hinted at this when they first meet at a party, when they're having a big fight while the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade is passing right outside their window. These are long, dialogue-heavy scenes, intense scenes, and I know that you can't cut to footage that you don't have, but was that an aspect of the film that was committed to in production, and the only editing you could do in those instances was invisible editing, or were there alternate angles, inserts, or any kind of cutaways that you could have gone to, but you just didn't?
Most of the time, these were things they were committed to during production. I think, as Bradley was shooting, he really wanted to commit to how he thought the scene should play out in the film. So, and I think the longer we shot, the more committed to that he was. And there was very few instances where we had like a boatload of coverage that we can cut to. But, and I think when you watch the film, if you see a scene that has like a number of different setups and angles, then that's what the coverage was. And we used it and we edited it as it was. And, and really, I mean, I really like the idea of every edit being invisible. I don't want you to be thinking about how we're editing it. But I suppose by not editing, you are also making a dramatic point about the editing. But I love what Kevin said about that, and Kevin and I are friendly, so I'm like imagining him saying it.
It's not hard to imagine.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine. But it is true, because I think the idea of the editing that we did in this film was more about how are we telling the whole story of the film and what is the rhythm of the entire film, not just the rhythm that you create within a scene with editing. It's how does editing create a rhythm throughout the entire film.
Considering that an elaborate visual scene like that Carnegie Hall scene where the camera is all over the place and clearly you're breaking the rules of time and space to create a very kinetic, I'll use your word, rhythm, as opposed to the locked off extended dialogue scene like the Thanksgiving argument, it would seem maybe the two might require very different techniques from you. But actually, I'm wondering if it's very similar in that to finally tune those long dialogue scenes, are you still relying on things like splits and animats and fluid morphs?
Sometimes we did, but very rarely. I would say the only time maybe we played a little bit with the tools of time, as I like to call them, the tools of time, were when they're first getting to know each other in the Cherry Lane Music Theater. They leave the party and they go to the little theater where she's performing her play and they're playing, they kiss for the first time. I mean, that was sort of a long take as well. There are edits there, though, if you're really looking and paying attention. But most of the time, and I want to say the Thanksgiving Day sequence, that was just one take. We got 4 of them, I think, that day, something like that. And I just picked one take and I just put it in, and that's it.
Well, you picked a good one. For either type of scene, with how specifically they're shot and how you're also sometimes doing match cuts between some scenes, it would seem to require some close collaboration between you and Bradley during production so that he knows what he's getting is going to work. Where were you cutting? Were you on set? And how were you communicating with him during production?
So I was not on set. He keeps a pretty much closed set for just performance reasons. There's no distractions, this and that, but also we're shooting this 2022 to early 2023. So there was still a lot of COVID protocols and, it wasn't wholly necessary for me to be on set, but it didn't mean that we were not in close collaboration. The way we collaborated mostly was via Evercast or just sending him cuts via pics. Sometimes he just said, just FaceTime me. Just record it. And
or WhatsApp, yeah.
Or WhatsApp or whatever. Yes, WhatsApp. And we did a lot of that. And it was a lot of back and forth during production while he was shooting. He always made time to look at whatever you wanted to show. And if he wanted to see something, he would ask for it. And it was a direct collaboration. So he saw so much of the film edited, as we were doing it. And I, the only delay was just waiting for the film to be processed, which for black and white, it was maybe 2.5 days. And for the color, it was maybe 2 days. But you had to wait because the film had to be sent to Photochem in LA from New York, processed, put in a bath. And there's only one bath for black and white per day. So if you missed the drop off, you kind of missed it. And I think eventually, once I would get and sometimes I actually felt a little behind because he would know exactly. So in terms of like lining up how something would cut to another, an in or an out of a scene, he would just have playback. They had Q-Take, and I swear I was trying to get the little clips of Q-Take, and it wasn't until the very end of production that finally production was like, oh yeah, we can send this to you. Jeez.
Oh, that would have helped.
I know. I would have loved, next time now I know exactly what to ask for, but it's hard. It's hard when, production has a lot that they're dealing with, and last thing they want to deal with is another drop to editorial. They're already doing a drop, the original drop. So I did start cutting with the Q-Take, which you would get immediately, and it would have all the numbers and stuff, all the garbage on it, but whatever, you could at least, and sometimes Bradley would send me, oh, this is the take. That's awesome. He'd send me the Q-Take on his iPhone, which is probably not that's not secure at all, but it's him sending. But anyway, we had a lot of collaboration that way. It was very digital.
That Carnegie Hall scene I keep referencing, it's not the only elaborate visual scene in the film. As I think I said earlier, there's another scene or sequence that starts off with Felicia and Lenny having lunch with friends in a backyard. And the sentiment or setup here is about Leonard giving up the silly music and things he's done in the past to become the first great American conductor. Felicia says she wants to see what those things are. So Leonard grabs her hand and off they go from the backyard into a theater where a dance sequence with three sailors, because the piece they're listening to is called Three Sailors, takes place. And again, it's like the Carnegie Hall sequence. You're breaking the rules of time and space. Leonard and Felicia are sitting in the audience, then they're on the stage with the sailors, then Lenny is one of the sailors. I'm definitely interested to hear about the mechanics of how you executed all that so perfectly. But unlike Carnegie Hall, this one has a very specific undertone that you have to hit. You can see that Felicia is beginning to understand that Lenny might be able to give up the silly music, but he will never give up who he really is, which is, life as a gay man, closeted, but not giving up on romantic encounters with other men. And she's going to have to find a way to be okay with this if she wants him to be in her life. Again, I'd love to hear about the techniques you used because visually it's stunning, but I'm really interested in hearing how you work to get that important story point across in a scene with no real dialogue.
Subtext is the most important thing to cut with, but, in this case, you get the subtext from the performances, and I think Carrie, you can't say enough how amazing she is in this film. There's her performance sells it. It lets you know how she's feeling and they're complicated feelings. I also think the dance itself tells a story of them. They're watching it and the joy of it, but they're also, Bradley is using it as a way to show you how they're going to come together and be pulled apart in their life and how they're both going to be in this mix. And I think, it's also important to note that Lenny didn't only want, Felicia wasn't the only woman in Lenny's life. He also, loved other women as well. But I think it's more, I guess, the definition of an open marriage now. But I think that this sequence was very well choreographed. I mean, it's a Jerome Robbins choreography, but also in collaboration with Justin Peck and Bradley to find the right parts of the actual choreography from these musicals that would represent the film and the story that Bradley's trying to tell in the film. I mean, technically, it's all very precise. We were working with a visual effects team, Phosphine, John Baer, was our visual effects supervisor, and they were always on set whenever they were shooting these pieces that would have to come together, and we would see the previs of it almost immediately afterwards. So I kind of knew with, when you're coming from the overhead of the picnic table or the table outside into theater hall, how that was supposed to play together. And then from that point on, it was just really cutting the ballet of it, which is always so fun.
Well, with a movie called Maestro, you'd think I would have gotten around to asking you about sound already, so maybe I better get to that. In any film, doing temp score and how an editor approaches that can be a challenge, and everyone's process is a little different. Knowing that, were Bernstein's pieces already written into the script? And if not, were there guidelines or rules about how to spot his music, whether maybe it had to have been published by the time the scene it's featured in is taking place, or any other meta aspects that dictated where those tracks should be placed?
Most of the cues were already written into the script. There was a handful that were not, but Bradley had them on hand in his mind he just said, here are the tracks I really kind of want to try to use, but I don't know where quite yet, but please load them into the bin. And as we assembled and honed the reels down, we would just naturally find a place for a cue, and usually it was Bradley driving that of saying, okay, I think let's try this cue here. But really we didn't start that until we were comfortable with where the reels were, and so once we had the reels and all the music that was already written into the script placed, there were certain spots that were bare and that were drive music. And then we went back and did a whole pass of, let's try this cue here, and so forth.
Did you only have the finished compositions to work with, or did you have access to any master recordings where you could manipulate any stems as needed?
We did not have any stems at the moment. We just had the master recordings. And, a lot of times that's fine. In the beginning, when we were working with it, we needed to sort of feel it, whether the cue was appropriate in tone, and does it fit in terms of the timeline of the story? I think that was key as well. But tone was also prominent. And I think once we were closer to, hey, we really like this cue here, I think we want to keep it, or these are cues that we know we want to use in the film. Once we start the mixing process, Bradley decided, hey, these are the cues that we're going to re-record so that we can have stems and we can, mix it in Dolby Atmos. Because, there were, I think in the beginning, we had 3 sequences that were recorded live, right? Where, you've heard the story of the 60 mics and this and that. But, there was only three of those, where we had live musicians and we had access to different stems and things like that. And everything else was the 2-track masters from actual Bernstein conducted music. So at that point, we're like, okay, we really do want this cue. It needs to match what we recorded, because we were finding that when we got on the stage, on the sound stage, that there was a huge discrepancy. Now, one can take a master and really sweeten it to try to match it, which we did in the case of the Adagietto of Mahler's Fifth. And we were able to do that there. And it's wonderful to hear, you can hear like Bernstein's breaths, and it's lovely to kind of have his ghost in there a little bit, But most of the time for the other cues, especially if they were score, it was really great to have a re-record and be able to fill the room that way.
We talked about techniques to tighten scenes visually, but we didn't really talk about doing it for dialogue purposes. Just as the black and white and the 4:3 elements give it a feel like a movie from the 40s, the dialogue is kind of in that style as well. It has a rapid pace, and the characters' lines often run right up against each other, often overlapping. Was there anything you did there to create or reinforce that style? And either way, did that style present any challenges for you in doing the editing?
No. Bradley, as the director, he is controlling the pace within the scene, if he's in the scene. And, I think they did that performance-wise. I didn't really have to do any of that, when they were doing it. And even when we got out of the 40s and there was overlapping dialogue in the 60s and the 70s, it was really one of the things of their natural conversation and something that I believe they wanted to enforce with their performance instead of giving the pauses to wait for sound. Now, did this present a challenge to sound? Probably, but I think if we were happy with the overlaps that were happening, which we were because we wouldn't have put them in there, it might have caused an issue, but that's more of a question for the sound guys than for me.
Well, as far as the sound design goes, for a movie rich with music, and you can check me on this if you feel differently, but it did feel to me like there was a conscious choice to lay back a little on the sound design. Mm-hmm. The first time I noticed this was a scene where Felicia's having lunch in a restaurant with her daughter and one of her friends. And even though the restaurant wasn't too busy, there wasn't a lot of restaurant walla, let's say. Mm-hmm. And also there's a scene where Lenny's taking Felicia to a doctor's appointment. I'm sure it's a private hospital, if not a private practice, but again, very quiet. Mm-hmm. I definitely risk overanalyzing these things for the sake of taking a lot of notes. But what was your approach or philosophy about doing the sound design for this film and editorial?
Bradley is very particular in how he wants the sound to be. And I think there was an effort made to not have any distractions. You really want to focus on the scene at hand. And there's just something about, when you're putting in a walla and you're doing this, that you're kind of making it feel like it's just, I don't know, there's some like quotidian, this is just a normal day, scene. Yeah. And instead of having the focus on what they're saying. So I think that was really just a focus of Bradley's, is to not fill it with a bunch of sound effects. What I will say is there's one scene, I didn't realize this until I was on a panel with Tom Ozanich, who was one of our re-recording mixers, and he was talking about the scene at Cherry Lane Theater and how that they actually had to clean up all this sound because there was a lot of sound from the camera, actually, that black and white camera. And they actually had to fill it back, but it's so subtle what he filled it back with in terms of the air in the room, feeling of the space and how much echo, how much, and that's a scene that doesn't have any music until the very end, until you're out of the scene. But design-wise, it has things in it. And I remember specifically we found this buzz that we kept from our rough cut into the mix from the ghost light that's in the center of the stage there. It comes and goes, this buzzing of the light, but it has like a certain so I would say the design is we kind of pick certain things, but we try to be very delicate, as we did with the cutting, minimalist in what we decided was an important thing to be present instead of filling it with stuff.
Well, as far as needle drops go, I mean, who needs needle drops when you have Lenny Bernstein's catalog to work with?
Right.
But you do have two that come to mind late in the film after Felicia's death. Mm-hmm. I originally wrote in my notes that one of them had to be scripted, but then I went back and looked at the film again, and that's not necessarily the case, but we'll find out. And that needle drop in question is REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I feel fine. It plays diegetically from Lenny's car stereo as he pulls up to an outdoor music venue. He's doing some guest lecturing. Mm-hmm. And of course, the snippet from the song we hear is when they shout, Leonard Bernstein, which is, of course, a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And when I first watched the scene, I kind of wished we could have seen the look on his face when that part played, but it's all done in a wide shot. Mm-hmm. It feels safe to me to assume that you had that needle drop locked down before shooting, and shooting it and leaving it wide was the creative choice that you all made. But at the same time, I should ask about how you did incorporate that song. Was it always nailed down from the beginning, or was it a process?
It was not. I just remember Bradley and I were cutting, and he was like, let's try putting this in. And it was just a little bit of a chuckle. And I remember we put it in and we spotted it to when the jag pulls around and you would hear that Leonard Bernstein, and he just had a laugh. He just enjoyed himself at that point. He's like, is it too much? I was like, no. Because, I know you're thinking it's like, oh, should we see how he's reacting? But what's better to be on the back of the Jag where his license plate says Maestro 1? It's like, clearly someone who is going to be playing a contemporary song that mentions him.
Mm-hmm. I love that you guys just sort of found that in the cutting room, and I'm glad you went with it because it was it's a great break at that point in the film. It's a nice little note, no pun intended. Early on we talked about using the radio announcer to provide context. Mm-hmm. And you also provide context, as you talked about, in ways you use color and aspect ratio. But something you didn't do was titles for characters, places, or times. Was that ever considered? And if it was, what were the factors for or against doing that?
They were totally considered. It wasn't anything that Bradley planned in the script. It was one of these things where we had a version of the cut and people were worried that people were getting lost, in time. And we, as we always did, we tried it. We had dates at certain periods of time where we made maybe a big time jump. And all we would put was 1971 or 1943 or something like that. 1985. And it made people think about it more. It made them focus too much on what year it was and what it meant instead of the emotional jump or the emotional cut that we were trying to do. Because really, when you're talking about a relationship, and especially a long relationship that spans time, it doesn't really matter that something happened 10 years or 5 years apart. It's still themes that continue in their relationship. And we felt like these jumps were strong enough and the emotional ties were strong enough that we didn't need to tell you that it was 1970. It was very just arbitrary. And it actually didn't matter. So why present an audience with something that doesn't matter? You're just going to take away from your main emotional train of thought that you want them on.
Well, I asked about beginning the film and the challenges involved with that. I should probably ask you about the equally challenging aspect of closing the film. I think you can consider I guess we'll call it the beginning of the ending, to be when we return to the interview Bernstein was doing at the beginning of the movie. Mm-hmm. He says a few more things about Felicia and then asks the crew if they have any questions. Then it cuts to young Felicia in black and white and widescreen looking into the camera, and then she turns her back to the camera and the title Maestro comes up. And then it cuts to black, the credits start, and you have footage of the real Lenny Bernstein conducting. Again, lots to unpack there. Please tell me about how you came to that ending, and considering where you dropped the title and also considering something you said earlier, is Felicia the real Maestro?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there. Bradley would be so happy that you actually got that.
Oh, good.
Because I think that is the idea behind where that title lands. The fact that the second to last shot is on her. And I think we wanted to state it that way, that she is the real Maestro. And it's more of a reinforcement that the story isn't necessarily about Lenny and his career, but about the two of them and her impact on him.
We started our talk discussing working with Sean Penn and now Bradley. So clearly this is not your first time working with a director who's also an actor. Did you notice anything specific about the notes or direction you were getting from Bradley that would speak to his experience as an actor?
I mean, of course, I never had a question about performance, number one. I mean, first of all, it was always, usually they would shoot and he would just basically stop shooting after he got it. So really it was either second last take or the last take. So in terms of that, there was never any performance notes. I never had to address anything like that because it was just so, I don't know, obvious to me in the footage, and he was giving you what he wanted anyway. But I think in terms of Bradley, it's not just, he doesn't come at the filmmaking from just the one actor's perspective. I mean, I feel like, throughout his career, he has spent a lot of time in various editing rooms. I think even from the time of Alias, and also like just sticking around and getting to know directors and being on set and just looking at how everything else is done. I mean, I haven't been in his shoes. I can't speak to his experience personally, but I know that he is really involved in every aspect. So I think, when I worked with him, it was very much like a director who happens to be a very successful actor.
Well, this is a big movie, one that had a lot of expectations going in, one in which you were clearly up to the challenge. That said, what was the biggest challenge for you in cutting this film?
I think one of the challenges for me was to change my idea of how much to cut. Not that I was cutting just a cut. I always adhere to the ethos of cutting when you have to cut, when it calls for it. But this was something that I think I had to further restrain myself. And in that restraint, it allowed me to think of, it's hard for me to describe, but it allowed me to kind of open myself up a little bit, like way more to the performances, to having the film tell its story. And for me to open my ears, instead of telling it what to do, it was telling me what to do. And to look at the footage again and say, okay, what is the essential and what is the strongest, and how can we use as little cuts as possible? So I think for me, the restraint was not only that, but also finding the waves and the rhythms in the film as a whole, and being able to look at the film as a whole every time and not just focus on certain scenes, because we didn't really have to focus on certain scenes when they were just one shot, or two shots, right? So I think that was the challenge, is really trying to tell a whole story that would span across decades and to keep the pace going for that.
Well, I asked you whether Felicia was the real Maestro referenced by the title, but I think I've actually figured out it's really you, Michelle. That was an amazing composition you put together. Congratulations.
Thank you, Matt.
Yes, take a bow, Michelle. You really are the maestro behind the media composer. Congratulations again to our guest, Michelle Tesoro, on a terrific film, and a big thank you to her for making the time to talk to us today. I hope all of you listening enjoyed this as much as I did, and if you haven't yet, check out Maestro on Netflix. So it's 2024 now, a new year, perhaps a new you? A you that learns all that you can about Avid Media Composer. Yes, there's lots to learn in Media Composer, but it's the fun kind of learning, not the trigonometry or calculus kind. No way, I'm talking fun. And it is the kind of fun that can maximize your talents and your bank account, if you work real hard. What isn't hard is finding out what's new with Media Composer. So click that link in the show notes and it will speed you on your way to avid.com. That's right, just one click. All right, time to close up shop. Thank you for dropping by. Always happy to have you over. Even if I'm not here, just come on in and help yourself to whatever's in the fridge. Until next time, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.